Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to have the company Util with us today for our today's session. Today, we will discuss more applied questions concerning artificial intelligence after we had discussed more classical approaches to AI, starting from Turing to Searle and also to Dreyfus. Today, we would like to discuss these questions from a more applied perspective. And I'm really happy to have three people from Util here with us. And they will now present some information about their company.
What I wanted to do is just spend a couple of minutes with two things. One of them is a little bit of my background and also partly the background of Util and why a company like ours uses AI and why that's an important thing in the space that we're in. So the first thing is I actually came to Util from a previous company that used AI in finance and in work for the US government as well, primarily addressing a really key challenge, which is that there aren't enough human analysts in the world to tackle the major issues of analyzing data. We had a project in my last company where they calculated that in order to do the same work as they projected to do using AI, they would need to hire 8 million human analysts. And so they simply could not do that without technology helping them. And that's very much the kind of theme of a lot of AI work that is going on. I'm sure you've discussed that a lot. When it comes to Util, we're attacking a very similar problem, but we're also attacking one that I think has a more kind of global relevance, which is we are trying to make sure that the investment world has the information that it needs in order to align those investments with sustainable outcomes. What we've seen is that generally financial markets work very well if you want to understand financial risk, and if you are good at that, you can make money. But at the same time, there are tons of companies that are rewarded in the market, but have very unsustainable practices. And what we've seen is that oil companies do extremely well. We know that that will have to end at some point, but still everything goes on the way that it normally does. Energy companies are very similar. There are plenty of companies that fall into that category. And yet, if an investor really wants to understand how do I make an investment that is better for the world than just a kind of thoughtless allocation of money, how do I do that in a realistic sense? And we face the exact same problem that I faced in my last job, which is there's too much information, too much complexity to be able to understand this. And the one thing that I would add to this that I think is really critical is that we are dealing with a world that is and I'm going to make a distinction between two words that sound very similar. The world used to be complicated, and that means that the relationships between problems are linear. So it's basically a question of adding things. And the more you add, the more you need to add to the other side in order to counteract it. It's just a perfect balance. There's more data, you need more analysts. You have more data than that, you need more analysts. And that's a linear relationship. The world used to be like that. It is not like that anymore. It is now complex, which means there's multiple data sets at the same time. And it means that one analyst can't do enough. And it means that if you add data, you're actually exponentially multiplying the complexity of the data that you're using. And one analyst is not going to meet that in a linear way. So the graph no longer proceeds in a organized way. And so that's where you really need a technology that can scale in order to do that. So that's where we come in. And that's really the backdrop of why we use AI, is that the amount of information and the complexity of that information makes it impossible to do without technology to help us. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Raquel, who will take you through what our product looks like. And then, any questions about the AI side of things, the technicalities, and how our machine learning models work, we can address to Jose.
Sure. So what I'm going to show you now is a demo of what our product looks like and what we deliver to our clients. What we ship to our clients is basically data around the revenue alignment of companies on the different SDGs. So the example I'll go over is Apple, and this can like start kind of any other questions that you have around how we put the results together and our methodology. But overall, the way we understand company sustainability is by looking at the percentage of revenue that is positively or negatively aligned to the 17 SDGs. So for those of you that are not familiar with them, the SDGs are a framework that looks at multiple areas of sustainability, from poverty to the environment to other things like democracy. So it's a kind of an all-encompassing and kind of quite complex framework that captures a lot of areas that we're interested in. So we, as I said, look at companies' revenue alignment to each of these different SDGs, and we do so by understanding the impact that these products, the company's products and services, have on each of the different SDGs. In the case here, I have pulled up Apple as an example, and what we see on the left-hand side is a chart where each of the segment represents each of the different SDGs. And what we see is that, for example, for a product like smartphones, is that if I click on it, we see the different SDGs where we find it has an impact. So we see that smartphones have a positive impact on health, which is SDG 3, or education, which is SDG 4, but a negative impact on SDG 12, which is around responsible consumption and production. In order to understand this impact and understand where it's coming from, we use our machine learning models on millions of peer-reviewed academic text to draw these conclusions around the impact. From those calculations, what we end up with is basically a measure of whether a positive is very positive, or whether a product is very positive or very negative. And we combine that with each individual product's revenues in order to understand for a company as a whole how much revenue is positively or negatively aligned to each of the different SDGs. I think one of the things that is definitely the most interesting about kind of what we do and how we express it, at least, is that we look at all the positives and all the negatives and take into account that not everything is going to be black or white. As in with the examples with smartphones, we see that it does contribute positively in a number of areas, but there are some kind of negative outcomes that also arise from the use of these products. And we aim to capture all of these different nuances in how we understand the impact of companies. Another very interesting thing that we capture, and is maybe a bit less related to the machine learning, but it definitely allows us to contextualize the results that we put together, is around where these companies are selling their products. So all of our data is adjusted geographically. So in this example here, we see that 25% of Apple's revenue is positively aligned to SDG 4. And the solid bar, the dotted line above it represents the unadjusted results. So what we mean by 25% of revenue that is geographically adjusted, we mean that we take into account how much relative need there are for these products in the location where Apple sells them, in order to adjust the results that come from our machine learning models. And we basically assign a higher positive impact to companies that are selling their products in locations where they're needed most, and discount those that are selling products where there is less need for them, and vice versa as well with companies with negative impact. I think that kind of summarizes a bit what we offer our clients and how our data looks. I don't know if Jose or Patrick want to add anything to it.
I'll just add a quick sense of the numbers before I turn it over to Jose to talk a little bit about the AI side of things. When we look at companies like this, one of our competitors, for instance, they've now increased the number of companies that they cover, but typically even a large scale operation in a large company data company will cover somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 companies. I would say the closest competitor that we have that operates in this space probably covers about 3,500 companies. That's a project in the Netherlands. We cover 45,000 companies. So that's every company that's listed on any exchange in the world. So that's already a significant number of companies that we cover. The next thing, just to sort of put some further numbers around it, for every company, we have a 5-year history. So that multiplies all of our data points by 5. For every company, we have all of the SDGs, positive and negative percentages, and we do that as a dollar value. And we have the scores that you see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen there as well. So for every company, we have about 750 or so data points. So when you think about a data set that is 750 data points for 45,000 companies and about 12,000 products and services, that's a very sizable data set. And, we've produced this data set with, a really small team. I mean, we've grown the team now, and we're only a dozen people. So, and that's to give you a sense of just the leverage for the amount of human input and the amount of machine output is enormous. And that's one of the things that's really key about using AI in the way that we do. But that's to give you some numbers. I'll turn it over to Jose. If there are any kind of particular things that you think would be of interest to the class around how we do the AI, that would be interesting.
So as I was saying, so obviously the question here is how do we actually use the machine learning to get to this point? And here, where we have a really complex system of different machine learning models, but from a more theoretical point of view, what we're actually doing with the machine learning is not really predicting what the company does. But what we do is we use machine learning at scale to identify and aggregate the knowledge that is already out there, in our case, in academic publications. So we have a pool of around 120 million academic publications, a number of articles that an analyst, even a bunch of analysts or millions of analysts, like Patrick was saying, would really struggle to read and understand. And even if they could read and understand them, how would you keep consistency across analysts? How are you sure that one analyst is not introducing their own biases, or another analyst is not skipping some parts? So the idea is okay, how do we go from these 120 million articles, and how do we identify every single instance of a company product or action and a sustainability theme? In our case, we have defined the SDGs. So we focus on, what's the impact of these products that we see here? So for example, in the case of Apple, smartphones, music and video streaming, wearable devices, on the different themes that we have, in this case, Sustainable Development Goals. So what we do is we ask the machine learning. So the machine learning will find all the articles that say, smartphones have an impact, either positive or negative. So smartphones may be good for health because they allow people to share information. You can you can call an ambulance faster. You can and get access to information about health. So smartphones may be good for SDG 3 health, but at the same time, smartphones produce a lot of waste. So the question is how do we get all this information together, and then how do we aggregate it so we end up having a single value for each company against each SDG? And here's where our machine learning takes place. So I mean, obviously I can get into the really detailed part of the machine learning, but I suppose maybe it's more interesting what the type of models that we use, more high level. And so what we use is what it's called transformer-based models. That is one of the latest advances in machine learning. So probably you've all heard of all these GPT-3 and all these famous models that now are around, that they're used for for example, the other day I was reading an interesting article how they interviewed one of these models, and it was quite interesting on how they're able to respond to you. But actually what machine learning does is identify patterns in the data. So they're not really thinking. Machine learning doesn't really think right now. So we don't have a general AI yet. What we have is a system that is really good at being consistent and identifying patterns. So that means that like it's a system that is really good at identifying which articles say that smartphones are good for health and which articles say that smartphones are bad for climate change, for example. So once we have that and we aggregate all of that, then we get into a part that is not that much machine learning, but we have like a system of like a graph network where we connect every single company to products, to all these like thousands of different impacts. And then we aggregate it down to a single value per company and SDG, which is really helpful for our investors. And so I'm going to stop there. I don't know if there's any questions around all of this. I suppose like for us, it's kind of like an easy thing because we work with this every day, but I suppose like there's thousands of questions that could be asked around.